have one case to look at. It's TC 7-20, dealing with mezzanines. Before we get into the discussion on the text change today, I'd like to open it up to the public and see if we have any comment. But before we get into the public comment, does anybody off of the Planning Commission have any public comment they would like to make before we get into the meeting? I'm not seeing any comments, so I will open it up to the public and see if they have any comments not relating to the text change, just in general, before we get into the text change for today. Okay, Keegan, I'm going to pass the ball back to you, and then we'll talk about the changes proposed, and then we'll open the floor for discussion to the commission. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Let me share my screen. Okay, so today we are here to discuss TC 720 mezzanines. And before I get started, I just wanted to let you all know in advance that this was brought as a petition of citizens. And unlike most other text changes, there is actually an outside applicant in this instance. Mac Paul and Ted Van Dyke, I believe, are participating, and they will be available for comments and questions after my presentation. And I believe we may have one other member of the public not related to the applicant who may speak as well. So this particular text change is a request to modify the definition and associated regulations in the UDO for mezzanines. So a mezzanine is generally considered kind of an intermediate space within a story or level of a building that is typically open to the space or floor below. And we'll get into the specific definition that's being proposed. But just to give you an idea of what we're discussing. And it's important to note that mezzanine can also cover what may be thought of as loft spaces or a larger kind of commercial mezzanine that you might see in a hotel or in some type of ground floor context. So the request is really centered around accomplishing 5 main objectives. So the first is that it would permit a mezzanine or mezzanines to be located on any one story of a building. Currently, the definition requires a mezzanine to be located within the first floor or first story of a building. And this would open it up, again, to permit it on any level, such that a loft type space could be potentially created at the top of a building, which I think is part of what initiated this specific request. Second, it would expand the allowance in floor area of a mezzanine to 50% of the room or space in which it is located. Currently, the standard is 33%, and this would increase that percentage to 50%. Third, it would clarify that multiple mezzanine spaces can exist within the same story of a building. Currently, the code could be interpreted such that a mezzanine has to essentially occupy the entire building width, as opposed to being subdivided with vertical walls. And one could think of a top level of a residential tower that has multiple side-by-side loft units that each have an individual mezzanine that are all on the same lateral or horizontal plane of the building and within the same story, but are, spaces unto themselves. So this would help clarify that that is an allowable configuration. And then in addition to these kind of 3 major changes, the request would continue to restrict mezzanines to only one story of a building, and would require spaces that would otherwise qualify as a mezzanine to be counted as a story. So the way the code is worded, a mezzanine that meets the proposed definition is really considered an interstitial space within the story, and it does not count as a story itself, But if you were to include multiple spaces, let's say one on the ground story and one on the top story of a building, one of those would be counted towards your overall story limit. And again, the UDO regulates building height in stories and feet, and actually only regulates building height in stories for buildings 7 stories and above. And that was a recent text change that came through previously. The fifth kind of objective would bring the UDO definition and associated regulations more closely in line with the building code by removing references to open and footprint and clarifying that a mezzanine is an intermediate level within a story. A little bit of background on the current definition. So it was added in 2018 as part of the attics and basements text change. And at the time, buildings were not limited in how many mezzanines they could contain, nor where they could be located internally. And so during the discussions around this attics and basements text change, there was concern that mezzanines were not being properly accounted for, and that they could contribute to overall intensity. And so the definition was added to the UDO to kind of bolster the intent behind the UDO and governing building height and intensity. And it roughly mirrored that of the building code. However, it kind of took a more hardline stance, such that the maximum floor area of a mezzanine was limited to 33%, and that it could only be located on the first floor. So the baseline standard within the building code is 33%. And then under special circumstances, if there's... Yes.
I am so sorry to interrupt. I am getting some messages from RTN saying that they're having technical issues, and they've asked me if you can stop.
Okay. I will defer to Chairman Mann. I'm happy to pause until we have that resumed or resolved.
Was that message?
Okay.
Was that from Mr. Perez?
That's right. I believe they're having some technical difficulties with RTN. So I'm happy to pause until maybe that's resolved, or I'm happy to proceed.
Let's pause until we hear back from Mr. Perez and see what we've got.
Yeah. Give me just a second as I communicate with them so that they can give me the green light.
Okay.
One moment.
Mr. Perez, are you still online?
Yes, sir. I'm trying to get.
I'd like to, if you can you get a consensus or some kind of idea of the last thing the public heard in Mr. McDonald's presentation?
So their message that I just received from them is, we have it now, just pick up where you were. So I think they're okay now. You can just continue from where you were.
Okay, thank you. You ready?
Yes, I'm ready. I'm happy to just go back to the top of the slide.
Can you back up one slide just in case?
Sure.
Yeah, just okay.
Just to the request again?
Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah, and I will go over this quickly. So again, the request is really 5 parts. One is to allow for a mezzanine or mezzanines to be located on any one story of a building. Again, the current definition would only be permitted on the first story, and this would allow it to be located elsewhere within the second goal is to allow for the mezzanine to occupy up to 50% of the floor area. This would be an increase from the current limitation of 33%. The third objective is that it would clarify that multiple mezzanine spaces can exist within the same story of a building. This is of particular interest in a residential context where you may have multiple side-by-side loft units that are separated by vertical walls, but otherwise exist on the same horizontal plane in the same story. The request would also continue to restrict mezzanine in the building. A separate mezzanine or additional mezzanine spaces could be provided. However, each additional mezzanine space would count towards the overall story limit, which is of particular note given that buildings 7 stories and above are only measured by the number of stories and not by a feet in height measurement. And fifth, it would bring the UDO definition closer in alignment with the building code by removing references to open and footprint and clarifying that a mezzanine is an intermediate level. The background on this is that the UDO definition was added in 2018 as part of the TC 1716 text change. It was out of concern that mezzanines were not being properly accounted for and that they may contribute to the intensity and potential occupancy of a building. And so a definition was enacted that roughly mirrored that of the building code. However, it was somewhat more strict in that it limited the floor area to 33% of the space in which it was located, and only allowed mezzanines to be located on the first floor of a building, which really limited them to more of a commercial context. One thing that I did want to note is that the building code does allow for some increased floor area of mezzanines under special circumstances. The first being if the mezzanine has a special occupancy, if it has a special industrial occupancy, then the floor area of the mezzanine can be up to 2/3 of the space in which it's located. It's also allowed to be up to 50% under the building code if it is of type 1 or type 2 construction, which really deals with the fireproofing ability of the construction, and that the space is equipped with an approved automatic sprinkler system and an approved emergency voice/alarm communication system. So I just wanted to note there are some differences between the building code, but they do serve somewhat different purposes, and that's text change is to develop a UDO definition that serves the interests of the UDO and its overall intent. So the proposed text is shown here, and you have it displayed here as it appears in the ordinance. So the strike-through language is what's existing and would be removed. The underlined language is what would be added. And I know this may be difficult to read, but I did want to show it to you first. And secondarily, kind of the clean version of the text. So this would be in the defined terms, and it would define mezzanine as an intermediate level above the room or space in which it is located. So again, this would very closely mirror that of the building code. The second change, and more substantially, is to really how mezzanines are regulated. And we've chosen to add these additional regulations to Section 331 of the UDO dealing with height requirements. We think that's a logical place for currently the floor area maximum is located in the definition section, and we think it could be missed. So this is a reorganization effort. But in addition, again, it would increase the allowable floor area of a mezzanine from 50% or from 33% to 50%. If it tips that percentage, then it is counted as a story. We make explicit that only one mezzanine is permitted per building, and that any additional intermediate level otherwise qualifying as a mezzanine is considered an additional story. So to touch upon the impacts of these changes. I think first and foremost, it would provide greater flexibility in the design of buildings and mezzanines, clearly. It would allow larger mezzanines and for them to be located elsewhere in the building, and also really permit them in more of a residential context for potential loft units, which seems to be of particular interest. There is some thought that increasing the maximum floor area of the mezzanine from 33% to 50% could impact the intensity and occupancy of the building. In addition, elimination of the word open from the definition could lead to reliance upon the buildings code definition and openness criteria. And I note that because the building code has a much more flexible definition of openness, and I included that in the staff report for you all to review. Two things of note. Within the building code, mezzanines are generally supposed to be open and unobstructed to the room in which they are located, except for walls not more than 42 inches in height. However, there are multiple exceptions, and two of particular interest are that if the mezzanine or portion thereof has an occupancy of less than 10, then there's no restriction on how open it must be. So you can think of a small room, for instance. If that is part of the mezzanine, it would not have to be open. A second portion is that a mezzanine having two or more exits or access to exits is not required to be open. And a mezzanine or portions thereof that are not greater than 10% of the overall mezzanine area do not have to be open either. So I just wanted to point that out, that removal of the word open from the definition would leave that, would eliminate kind of the interpretation of what a mezzanine is. And it's thought that as it's currently understood, and open is completely open, more or less, rather than portions thereof being enclosed. So with that being said, there is some alternative language that staff would like to make note of. And again, since this is being brought as an outside request, the ordinance as drafted does not show this alternative language. This is just for your consideration. But we did want to share it with you all. So the first portion would be to just add the terms "and open" to the proposed definition. Again, we think that would clarify that it's meant to be truly open and would not lead to reliance upon the building code definition or challenges to what is considered open as far as a mezzanine is concerned.
Hey, Keegan, I'm sorry to cut you off, buddy. Quick question.
Sure.
After "and open," I see we strike through the words "to the first floor below." Is it the intent to keep the word "to" in there because it is reading kind of confusing? And
correct. Yeah, I apologize for that. Yes, it would read "to."
I got you. Okay. I'm sorry. Keep going.
Yes. Yeah. So an intermediate level above and open to the room or space in which it's located. The second proposed change would be to keep the threshold as is at 33% instead of 50%. Again, this is just driven by consistency with how the code is now and concerns that increasing to 50% could lead to a tipping point in terms of intensity and or occupancy. These are just alternatives for your consideration. And again, the draft ordinance represents what was discussed and agreed upon between staff and the applicant in this instance. So I believe that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any additional questions you may have. And if not, I believe the applicant is here to speak on the matter as well.
Okay, thanks, Keegan. Before we get to the applicant, does the committee have any questions for Keegan before we move? Commissioner O'Haver.
Thank you, Commissioner Mann. Keegan, great job. I have a few questions, but I want to start with an overarching question. And David, maybe you can help with this. My understanding of the UDO and the revised UDO that we put in place back in 2013 was that UDO was not meant to regulate intensity, that it was a quasi-form-based code, and that That's why we're measuring by stories and height. And actually, I've had a couple of projects where we've gone through staff and have confirmed that intensity was not meant to be regulated by the code. Do I have that correct?
I may not be the right person to answer this, but there is a more leniency in intensity under the code. The code still has intensity limits. For example, if you're in a mixed-use district that's not a conditional use district that has voluntarily taken on additional restrictions, the intensity of the development is limited by the number of stories. That's still a form of limiting intensity. In the mixed-use general districts, it's been limited by just that, the height of the building. Obviously, the residential districts, they're all limited based on density, R1, R2, R4, R6, and so forth.
Right.
But yes, there was a loosening up of how the code regulates intensity. There's no longer an FAR calculation unless it was voluntarily agreed upon by way of a zoning condition.
Okay, thanks, David. That makes sense. And yeah, certainly the R classifications, certainly. I was thinking more of mixed use. Another just quick question. Keegan, can you go back to the background slide? I don't know which number it was. I don't know how to tell which slide. That one right there. So if I understand this correctly, above 7 stories, we're measuring by stories only. And so if I look at that picture to the right at the top there, how am I to tell if that's a open ceiling floor plan or if there's a mezzanine in there? If we're below the height threshold or the story threshold, how they're measured, how do I tell if that's just that penthouse suite that I'll never be able to afford that has nice high open ceilings with the view to the city versus 33 or 50% mezzanine from the average, obviously building code, there's review of plans, et cetera. But I just want to make sure if we're putting this in place that we're going to be measuring by stories above 7 stories, and you start thinking about 12-story buildings, 15-story buildings, 20-story buildings. I'm curious how the impact of that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess not being an architect or having the engineering background, my comment would just be that you're correct. I think visually, it's very likely that a structure could be built with a very tall floor-to-ceiling height on the top of a building and be visually similar to that of a loft or mezzanine space within that floor. I believe we define story in the UDO, although I'd have to check to be certain. But there is a lot of flexibility built into how tall each of those stories are. And I think that was taken into consideration when the feet and height measurement was removed. Of course, as you get taller, there's constraints both from an engineering perspective and from a cost perspective about how tall those stories are. But I do think that's a valid point. I know it came up in our discussions as well that while unlikely, part of the reason in limiting mezzanines to only 1 per building is it would curtail the creation of multiple stacked loft spaces, which could lead to a much taller building. Let's say if there were 4 or 5 of those levels, while unlikely it could happen. And this would, bring a building with a mezzanine closer in terms of height to that of a normal building that doesn't maybe have a loft space or mezzanine level.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Mann. That's all I have now. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions from the committee? Mr. Paul, the applicant, do you have anything to add or would like to talk about?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, but do you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll just make a few comments about background and just kind of the solution that's on the table. First, I just want to thank the committee and staff for having the meeting, because I know it's tough to pull these virtual meetings together, and no one right now really knows what the schedule is going to be like going forward in July. But I do appreciate taking the time and making this happen today, because I think it'll advance the conversation and let us know kind of where the Planning Commission is on this issue. Just for a little interesting background, a number of years ago, the Whole Foods Colonnade up in North Raleigh, around 2008, was the first time I kind of encountered the issue of mezzanine with the city, because the Planning Commission at that time was very insistent on applying the urban design guidelines, which mandated a minimum of 2 stories in these mixed-use centers. And so there was a lot of sensitivity about retail development not being more multiple stories, form-based. So given the constraints on cost and development, we came up with a compromise in that scenario of requiring through a zoning condition that there be a minimum amount of mezzanine space in the building up against Colonnade and Six Forks to create more of a, an urban feel to it. And in that case, the question came up, what do we know? How do we know what a mezzanine is? And it was determined that we would follow the building code using the term mezzanine in the zoning condition, and the way it would be applied and enforced would be looking at the building code definition. Fast forward, to this year, and Ted Van Dyke and I were working on a project, and the administrative site review comment came back, and this is after the text change that Keegan described to you last year with attics and basements, simply asking the question, how does the space, and in this proposed development was going to have, mezzanine space in the top units of a condominium, how does it meet the UDO? So it's kind of a general question. It didn't say it ran afoul of the UDO, but it prompted a conversation with staff based on that comment. And initially, the determination we got back from the city was, well, no, that's not mezzanine space because it's not on the first level. And by definition, the mezzanine is now on the first level. So that would be considered loft space. So there's no issue with it. We continue to press for a more formal interpretation and got more people involved in the city in the conversation. And then, staff realized there was an issue with it on an upper level. And we knew that there had been some recent projects approved. The Fairweather under construction has mezzanine space on the top units, as well as the Lind, which was approved recently, has a similar configuration. But it was, I think the staff realized that the definition did pose a problem for this project. And so we worked with them to come up with a solution where we could come together with staff and come forward with something where we were kind of in unison about the problem. I think people recognize that there definitely was a problem with the definition of mezzanine because it referred to the footprint of the building rather than the building code definition of the space below or within a unit. So, we worked on this text change, and, we do have a project that has been approved without the mezzanine space, holding and hoping that we can get this text change done at some point so they can amend it and take and actually reintroduce the mezzanine space on the upper level of it. So I would just say that there are 2 issues I see that Keegan did a very good job of going through. One is the definition. Do we need a definition in Raleigh? If so, what is the purpose of the definition being different from the building code? We've simply tried to harmonize it as best we can with the building code definition to avoid confusion when someone does any development in Raleigh and it relates to a mezzanine and discrepancies between Raleigh and the International Building Code. So this definition seeks to make it more closely aligned with the building code definition. And then secondly, what are we regulating here? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? And I think in the meetings with staff, the one thing that was articulated that you've heard, and it really came about after this text change was adopted, and that is we've eliminated story height above 5 stories. So, as Commissioner O'Haver said, the UDO has gone to regulate through form, through height and stories. It used to be dwelling units and intensity under the old code, but that's not the way we do it anymore. So what is it that we're trying to regulate here with this? And I think there's some logic, particularly if you have a 10 or 12-story building, if you had a mezzanine on every level, that could, and there's no regulation on height, theoretically, I'm not aware of that ever happening, but, theoretically that could happen. But otherwise, it seems like having the ability to have a mezzanine, but you're still regulated by the height under the UDO, it takes care of the problem. So I think that from my perspective, having a conversation about how many levels a mezzanine could be on and having that addressed in Chapter 3 is the appropriate way to handle it. And we, in conversations with staff, agreed to come forward with only one level, and that's the way this project, this pending, is designed. But as I mentioned, as in the Fairweather has one on the ground level on one side of the building, and on the upper level on the other side of the building, still within the 75-foot height cap for a 5-story building. So there could be issues with that, but I leave that certainly to the Planning Commission and City Council to make those decisions. We're just trying to get the conversation going and to try to address the issue on the upper level, on the top level. That is now a problem with the definition. So that's really the points I wanted to make. Ted may have something, and we certainly can answer any questions you might have. And I really appreciate you bringing this forward for discussion.
Thank you. Ted, do you have anything to add to Mr. Paul's statements?
I can offer a couple things briefly. What I'd like to sort of suggest and reinforce what Max said is, the building code highly regulates mezzanines. They're not a trick that developers try to play to get extra stories into a building. A lot of the regulations in the building code are related directly to life safety. That's why a sprinkler building can have more area of mezzanine than an unsprinklered building. A wood building can only have a certain amount unless it's sprinklered, and a more intensively built steel building can have more. It all relates back to life safety. One of the reasons a mezzanine above 50% is counted as a story in any event is the occupancy becomes high enough that it requires 2 exits and an elevator, in which case it once again becomes a story. So there's lots of ways that mezzanines are regulated by the International Building Code. And to my mind, the less that we try to provide an alternate definition of this very sophisticated and very specific element in the building code, the better for our zoning code. To me, it seems like the issue is really that we have very recently eliminated height limits in buildings 7 stories and above. If we still had height limits, which I'm not advocating for or against today, but if we did, this idea that a clever developer could build multiple mezzanines and get an unlimited height building in a 12-story, for example, use would not be an issue. So following on Brian's comments earlier, we really don't have a form-based code. I sort of wish we did. If we really think about it, buildings 5 stories and below, we should probably, instead of undoing heights, we should undo stories. You can easily put a 4-story apartment building in a 45 or 50-foot tall envelope, but that's our 3-story limit. What the issue with having 4 levels of apartments in a 50-foot envelope is when we're trying to increase our housing stock and trying to increase options and increase density and lower sprawl, I don't know. This issue is a small one. These mezzanines are a very small part of any space. As Mac pointed out, they're really commonly found in apartments where we would call them lofts if they were single-family units. They look out onto the space below. Beyond a certain percentage of size or enclosure, the building code won't allow. There's not really a downside to my mind of simply referencing the building code for the definition of mezzanine. And if our concern is multiple mezzanines in heights above 7 stories could unduly lead to buildings in unlimited height, then certainly this text change limiting the number of mezzanines to only 1 level per building handles that situation for us. There'll probably be a developer who comes along and wants to put 2 levels of mezzanines in a premium condo project he wants sometime in the future, but that's something that can be handled if and when it ever comes up. I cannot, as Max says, think of a building where that's ever happened. I do know, and we can all see them, the picture that you guys provided was great. There's mezzanines all over. There's a lot of mezzanines in downtown office buildings on the ground level. A lot of lobbies that have a 20-foot height, say, and there's a mezzanine looking down on the ground level of the lobby. That's a very common pattern. This code change will continue to allow that in commercial uses. So I think overall it's going to accomplish what we need to do, which is to allay any fears about multiple mezzanines, while letting us have the flexibility we need to design apartments and condos that have this mezzanine component to them, which is what the market's looking for.
Mr. McDonald, see your hands up.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to address one thing that's come up in these conversations about harmonizing the UDO definition and the building code definition. I think I've gone over kind of in detail how they differ. And one other point that was raised in internal discussions about why we don't just include a reference is kind of twofold. One, the UDO and the building code are obviously separate texts with separate ultimate goals. And this is kind of a gray area, an instance of overlap in that there's a definition in the building code and then also one in the UDO, and they kind of have different intents in a way. But the idea did come up to provide a simple reference to the building code in the UDO. And there was concerns about the durability of a reference and understanding that that would be then subject to any change that occurs in the building code. And also we prefer the UDO to be one text that can be referenced by a designer for purposes of complying with the UDO, as opposed to then having to open a separate text to understand what the UDO is trying to get at. So I think as pointed out by the applicant, I think this definition is definitely closer in line with the building code, and I think goes a long way to accomplishing that for ease of use as well.
Okay. Thank you, Keegan. Before we get to that in the meeting, I'd like to get to the changes as presented. But before we get to the changes line by line, I'd like to now open it up to the public for questions and or comments. And please keep your questions and or comments to 2 minutes each, so we can go back to the proposed changes and look at it text by text, line by line, and get through it. Thank you. Do we have any questions or comments from the public? I'm not hearing any or seeing any. So, Mr. McDonald, can you bring up the changes as proposed, and so we can bring it back to the table and discuss definitions and text changes?
Sorry to interject, Chairman Mann, there was one comment that Ms. Tika would like to.
Well, I missed the name. What was the name again?
Tika Hicks.
Oh, okay. All right. Commissioner Hicks.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Commissioner Mann. I just wanted to let my fellow commissioners know I'm here today and listening in on the text change. And I don't have any specific comments. at the moment. I think the only thing I would say is from a designer standpoint, I think having to check the fewest amount of resources to understand what the requirements are for the mezzanine is useful. So I would tend to support what Mr. Van Dyke was saying, which was to try, not to send designers back and forth between the UDO and the building code. I think the building code does have a lot of specifics on mezzanines in particular. And so those are just my general comments for now. Thank you. And good to see you all.
Good to see you. Oh, good to hear you. Thank you, Commissioner Hicks. Keegan, can you pull up the proposed changes starting from the beginning?
Sure. Give me one moment. Okay. Hopefully this is visible. So yeah, this is the proposed text as shown in the draft ordinance for the definition.
For clarification, there isn't an alternative definition for a mezzanine. Is that correct?
That's right. It's in the staff report. If you're looking for the alternative language, it starts kind of towards the end. I apologize. I realize there's not page numbers here, but there's an alternatives considered section at the end of your report. And I can also scroll to that as well within the.
Yeah, let's review this, and then after we look at this, let's jump to the alternate definition of it, and then we can make a decision as to how we want to proceed.
Okay.
So, committee members, do we have any issues with the changes as proposed?
Okay, I wanted to look. Good, please.
Okay, I saw Commissioner Miller. Do you have a question or comment?
Yes, I just wanted to start by saying that, just by way of background, it sounds like there were some unintentional ambiguities that were created by the attics and basement text change. So I just wanted to thank staff and the private citizens that worked on this, initiated this, for engaging with the city to help improve and clarify our UDO. And I also wanted to thank Mr. McDonald and Mr. York and the rest of the staff that worked on this. I think that this UDO, this text change as written is very thoughtfully designed in terms of figuring out the context and the impacts of this text change on the other provisions of the UDO and the building code. And it's also really well written. And unambiguous language that really facilitates the ease in interpreting this. I know that doesn't happen by accident, so I just wanted to thank staff in this case for the text change. And most of my comments are going to be, I guess in the defined terms, with this one in particular, I think that came second for a little bit. I agree with staff and Ms. Hicks, Commissioner Hicks, that trying to figure out how we can have a definition within the UDO, I think makes a ton of sense, and for ease and for reducing ambiguity and that kind of thing. So, but my one comment, I actually pulled the definition of mezzanines from the building code. Pull that up right now. That I think might be helpful to pull in here. So my suggestion wouldn't be just to remove a definition and just make reference to the building code, but perhaps pulling the definition from building code and restating it here, but making sure it's the same type of language to avoid any ambiguity. The only real change is, as written here, it says it's an intermediate level above the room or space in which it is located. And I know that we had some comments from the public that had some concerns. What about if it was on a rooftop or something like that? And this is just technical, but the building code says an intermediate level or levels between the floor and ceiling of any story in which it is located. So maybe just adding that, just so that we can mimic as much of the language from the building code as we can here to clarify, or to fix any ambiguities between the UDO and the building code. Did staff see any issue with that?
This is Keegan. No, I think that makes sense. We were kind of using the just from the definition portion of the building code as a starting point. And I think that clarity that you referenced is kind of in a separate section, but I think it's useful. And I don't think it strays from our intent. And I think we can definitely add that if that's something that the committee is interested in adding.
Yeah, I don't think it changes anything substantively. It just sort of the concern that we've been getting about whether it's consistent with the building code or not. We could just make it consistent with the building code today. And if the building code were to change in the future, then it does. But we actually have, a set definition that we could choose to change in the future if we chose to in the UDO. But at least for now, it would go the same language from the building code.
So just so I'm understanding, the specific kind of change would be to clarify that this intermediate level exists between a floor and a ceiling. Is that right?
Yes.
Main portion of the change? Okay.
Commissioner Winters, did you have anything to add? Commissioner Winters, you're on mute.
I'm still processing that, so I'll come back to it, but thank you.
Okay. Can we now bring up the?
I'm sorry.
Okay. All right.
Forgive me. Just for clarity again, why are we removing the word? Why are we changing the definition and changing it from open again? Just to be clear.
To mimic the language in the building code. Okay. Can we bring up the alternate language? Here it is.
Yeah, and again, just to Chairman Mann's point that there's word "to" should not be crossed out there as far as issue and formatting. But the real change is just preservation of the term "open."
Mm-hmm.
And again, the reason for that is in talking with staff. The original purpose of the definition, or I guess I should say the original intent behind the definition, is a space that's truly open that you could, in layman's terms, look out below and see the space. And again, the building code, while very specific, it does allow for certain types of enclosure, and that's really a policy decision, but this is just to keep kind of the intent behind the original definition. But we are certainly open to whatever changes the committee would like to move forward, including removing that term if they so choose, or if you also choose.
Commissioner Thomasula, you have anything to add? I see your hand.
Yes, thank you. So I guess it was two things. Some of it just clarity. If it says open to below, does that mean if you have like a taller story on the first or on the top, usually it'd be the top floor or the bottom floor of a building where you'd see these, does that mean that you couldn't have, say, a bedroom in an apartment complex on that if it says open?
Yeah, I think this raises a valid question. I discussed that internally, and I think that's part of the benefit of the building code, isn't it? In that it does offer specifics about types of enclosures that would more than likely permit a bedroom or a small occupancy space to be enclosed. Now, the term open, and not meaning to be punny, but it's open to interpretation. And that's kind of the benefit of having it in the UDO, such that a reviewer would look at each case or each plan kind of on a case-by-case basis. And it may be something that warrants further discussion. This happens pretty frequently with parts of the UDO. But you're correct that it could lead to additional follow-up on a specific proposal if it's deemed that it's not open to the degree to which it's interpreted by the zoning administrator. Since specific criteria, it could result in a kind of case-by-case determination depending on what's proposed.
So thanks for that feedback. I guess with that, I think building on a lot of what we talked about in the last meeting when it comes to text changes. This is different because this is not necessarily, directly relating to delivering, specific housing, but like, I guess for me, it's like, I personally feel that we should be moving away from language that is ambiguous, that leaves it up to an individual to make a decision. And, I just don't see that as us necessarily doing our job to be somewhat fair. I definitely have complications with that from even a kind of a logic standpoint. Like that seems to place an undue burden on a reviewer, and then creates confrontation and a lot more unknowns when it comes to a project. I guess the other comment that I had was, most projects, I personally am not concerned with someone building some building of that's double height with mezzanines. It's like, I can't see that ever making sense. That said, you see these on ground floors and on top floors. And I think a lot of times when you see it, the same issues that we saw when we were doing that text change in 2018 with building height, particularly where this is going to come into play, are on larger sites, mixed-use buildings, and there's going to be grade change from one side of the building to the other. And, I understand that that I think this language was created because of one specific building and one incorrect, basically typo in the UDO, where a student housing apartment complex kind of gerrymandered, additional stories. Some of that had to do with calculating height. Some of it had to do with other things. And so I guess for me, the fact that most mixed-use buildings have 20 to 25-story first floors, that's how it is in the UDO. That's how commercial construction happens in this country now. And a lot of times there's some sort of activity space or suites on the top floor. I guess if we're already controlling for height, I guess I'm just kind of confused, for anything less than 7 stories. I guess I'm confused what the difference is if someone has a 25-story first floor and then a top floor with a loft for a few living units, and whether or not they put a intermediary, like lofted space on that ground floor, to me doesn't really matter. Like, I'm trying to understand what we're playing defense against, saying only one floor. Like, I mean, I guess my recommendation would be 2, because it allows for some flexibility for retail on the ground floor to have some seating above, say, a retail counter. We see that in most buildings downtown that are newer, that have to fit all of the mechanical, above the first floor to some degree, and then have some leftover space. And then the ability to have like an event space or whatever it is, a gathering space, or, premium units on the top floor, or access to the roof, or whatever it might be. Like, I guess I'm just a little confused. If you meet all the other boxes that protect against what I think this was created for, like, why we can't just kind of simplify this a little bit.
Thank you, Matt. Commissioner Miller, I'm sorry for cutting you off. Commissioner Miller, I saw your hand.
Yes, I agree with many of Commissioner Tomasula's points. And I know that that's in the next section that we're going to look at. And I have comments that are in line with his as well. Before we leave this one, I just wanted to do a quick clarification of my earlier comment. My suggestion was actually to make 2 changes, not just one. The first one, just looking at the definition of the building code, it says an intermediate level or levels between the floor and ceiling of any story. And so if we change this to say the same thing, an intermediate level or levels between the floor and ceilings of any story, then I think the level or levels would point to the clarification we're trying to make by calling it a room or space instead of a floor. And that would just be one additional change to tie it to the building code. So sorry, I meant to include that in my.
So we're talking about getting rid of the language "and open."
Well, I'm actually talking about instead of there's been a lot of discussion about just making it the same definition as the building code.
Mm-hmm.
But some pushback, we don't want to do it just by referencing the building code. So instead, I was going to suggest that we just take the definition within the building code and restate it in its entirety here. And I think that would accomplish the same intent of what we're trying to say here, but using the exact same language echoing in the definition would help remove that confusion. And so when I first said that, I only noticed the difference between saying an intermediate space above versus an intermediate level between the floor and ceiling. Mm-hmm. But then there was an additional change that I meant to mention as well, which is one of the concerns was as it was previously written, it made it seem like you could only have it one intermediate level for the whole first floor, as opposed to in multiple units on the same floor. So this would clarify that to say, if we use so that's why they changed it to the room or space. But if we just use the building code definition that says an intermediate level or levels between the floor and ceiling of any story, that might accomplish all of our goals.
Okay. So Mr. McDonald, I see your hand, Commissioner O'Haver, but Mr. McDonald had a question first, and I'll get to you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Commissioner Tomasulo's and Commissioner Miller's comments. One, to the intention behind requiring, or I should say limiting, only one mezzanine per building. We discussed the option, of course, to allow potentially multiple mezzanines, especially for structures that have a maximum height in feet measurement, because they are limited anyways. And so maybe it's less of a concern. And then also, again, I think as he stated, in mixed-use buildings, it's very common to have a potential retail or commercial type mezzanine on the ground floor, and then maybe a residential loft mezzanine on the top floor. So that's certainly something we discussed. Our intention behind leaving it as is was more just preservation of the current status rather than really a stance one way or the other in terms of policy. And then the second, just to follow up with Commissioner Miller, I'm definitely understanding your proposition for that change, and we can certainly incorporate that. I just wanted to understand, I don't have the text in front of me, but I did write it down quickly. Is your understanding of the term to say intermediate levels or levels, meaning potentially, let's say you have a first floor space that you could have one potential landing, if you will, that serves as part of a mezzanine and a separate landing as long as it's between the same floor and ceiling? Or are you thinking more just in a lateral sense? Or side by side?
I was thinking in a lateral sense in more than one unit, but if it would make sense to have multiple step-up levels to, say, provide a space for industrial equipment and one and that needs open air and another one that doesn't, and things like that, as long as it meets the other requirements in terms of total percentage of the floor area and those things, that I think that would make sense to not limit those options as well. But okay. Essentially the building code, it's section 2.202 in the building code, and it says a mezzanine, the definition of a mezzanine is an intermediate level or levels between the floor and ceiling of any story, and in accordance with section 505. So I would just strike that last portion, because obviously the most restrictive text would apply, and so if we read together, make that the building code apply as well. So just changing it to an intermediate level or levels between the floor and ceiling of any story.
Commissioner O'Haver, I saw your hand. Commissioner, you're on mute.
Okay, how about now?
That's perfect.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Mann. Couple things. One, Keegan, I guess just from the question you just asked Commissioner Miller about lateral and multiple lateral, I could see a situation like at Weaver Street Market where there could be, it might not be connected there at the corner, but you might need two separate entrances where it would seem like where they have two sets of steps already, that what would the difference be there? But my original question, and it kind of goes back with what Commissioner Winters, I'm still trying to understand open. So can you go back to the picture where you talk about that? So is that, yeah, that was it. That one. So is that open or is that not open? I'm maybe that will help me understand what we mean by putting the word open back in there. Like, what would that be considered?
Well, unfortunately, it's difficult for me to say with certainty, although I believe Justin Remetta is on the call if he wants to weigh in. He's the zoning administrator. I think there would have to be a determination made but on a case-by-case basis. I would say that I think open, as commonly understood, means completely open, more or less. And the building code allows for enclosures, and that's kind of the key difference. And I did speak with other staff about this because I wanted to, gauge how it would be interpreted. And I was told that as read in the UDO, it wouldn't necessarily jump to the building code to define open per se, because the building code is very specific and has specific exceptions included, and that they construed open to be more or less, can you look down and see the space below in its entirety? So I think a lot of smaller loft spaces specifically would probably more closely align with that definition, whereas maybe in a larger context, there's definitely the possibility for enclosures. So I will certainly agree that it's leaving it in the UDO means it's up for interpretation. And I think Commissioner Tomasulo commented on the potential negative consequences of that. But we wanted to present it just as an alternative in keeping with the original intent of the current definition.
Thank you.
Commissioner Miller, I'm sorry, I was on mute.
That's fine. I was just, I had a comment about the next section, but if I wanted to make sure we're tied up on the definition first.
Yeah, let's get tied up on the definition, then we'll move to the next. Yeah. Can you bring up the definition, please? And Mr. York, can we vote on this piece by piece, or do you want us to wait towards the end and get everything before we do any motions?
I think ideally, since this isn't the final recommendation of the full commission, I think what you can do is discuss to where you feel like you have a consensus for amendments or changes to what the staff has presented to you. And if everyone's in an agreement with those things, then you can just take it up and have one vote. When we get to the one vote, if there's a commissioner who feels like, I could support this, but only if the word open was, only if we left the term open to in the definition. If you did that, I'd support it. If you don't, I won't support it. I mean, then we can break it up that way. But I think for purposes of this and moving it along, if you all feel like you have a consensus with one definition over another, then I would just move on to the next section.
Absolutely. Can we go to the original definition, not the alternate? Okay. So what I was that we wanted to add in language from the building that in our definition of a mezzanine. So what I'm hearing is that we want to have instead of a room or space below, we want to have between floor and ceiling. language to reflect what's in the building code. Commissioner Miller, can you go over that definition again so we can get it clear as how we want to add it in?
I would just strike it as written and replace it with an intermediate level or levels between the floor and ceiling of any story.
Okay.
And I just want to clarify, this is based on the assumption that the UDO has a definition of story as opposed to floor.
Okay. Keegan, I saw your hand. Come on.
Yes. I will need to verify. I believe story is defined, but I can verify that in just a moment. I just also wanted to let you know, Chairman Mann, that Ted Van Dyke, representing the applicant, I think he does have a follow-up comment whenever you're willing to have him speak again.
Okay, Mr. Van Dyke, let's get your questions and comments before we move on.
Yes, thank you, Keegan and all. Just want to point out that when we're talking about the intensity and this question of open versus unopen, openness is defined in the mezzanine. It's in 505.2.3, but I just want to give you sort of a sense of the scale of the issue we're talking about. Mezzanines do need to be open. An exception, for example, is portions of mezzanines are not required to be open to the room in which they are located, provided the occupant load of the aggregate area of the enclosed space is not greater than 10. So we're talking about exactly what Matt was talking about, that mezzanines commonly will contain an upstairs bedroom or bathroom plus an open loft or area. But in any event, the amount of area that is allowed in the building code to be enclosed is very small because the building code is trying to be very clear that this is not a story and does not require the same kind of exiting, elevator access, and other things that a true story would require. So I wanted to kind of give some folks a little bit of peace of mind, maybe that allowing the building code to use a more sophisticated way of defining open. I just don't want to see the UDO suddenly dictating building design inadvertently once again, which is exactly what we're trying to fix from the previous text change. So, as an architect who has to deal with this, to the extent that we can let the building code govern what is and is not open and what is and is not allowable once the mezzanine, where we think they can be placed within a building in Raleigh and on which levels, I think we will find that we're not inadvertently allowing any gaming of the system here. The mezzanine code is going to be very specific and very strict.
Mr. McDonald.
I'm going to talk.
Yes, I just wanted to follow up on the question about whether or not story is defined in the UDO. So the term story is not defined. However, story height is within section 157C. And story height is defined as measured from the top of the finished floor to top of the finished floor above.
Okay. Commissioners, can you pull up the definition one more time, Keegan? Can we make a decision as to the definition mirrored from the building code moving forward? Would that alleviate or mitigate the problems that we have with the open space comments if we move forward with that definition?
Can I ask commissioners, some of the commissioners that work in this space technically, if that definition of story would be adequate here, or would it create any issues if that's the definition of story? Talking about a finished ceiling.
Keegan, can you repeat the definition?
Yes, give me one moment. So story height, again, is defined as story height is measured from the top of the finished floor to top of the finished floor above.
So if a mezzanine had a finished floor, would that create some ambiguity here? I don't know what the definition of a finished floor is.
I would have to look. I'm not sure if any of the other staff members on the call have a have knowledge of that offhand, but I would have to check.
Just want to make sure we don't create a circular definition.
Understood.
Commissioner Thomasula.
Yeah, so I guess and maybe this is just to help. I mean, I continue to kind of go back since I was around when this originated, and I know a lot of it was that one or two apartment developers got an additional, I mean, it's a real story that had circulation and had units that weren't connected to the units below them, or considered a mezzanine. Now, isn't it true that as written, like, this would prohibit that, since the mezzanine basically has to be kind of internal to the space below? Is that the idea around that, Keegan?
Yes, I mean, that's certainly the intention. I think what Commissioner Miller had pointed out is just to be certain that the floor of a mezzanine level, wherever that sits, is not counted as finished floor. And so I don't think, as written, that's not the intent, and I don't think it would be interpreted that way.
Okay, great.
But I'm happy to clarify that with staff and see if there's anything that needs to be added. But I think it's understood that because, especially that a mezzanine is not a story, and it have to be labeled as such, that a finished floor has to occur within a story. And so by its very definition, I think a mezzanine is precluded from having a finished floor in that respect.
Okay. In that case, then I would propose that we change the definition to strike what is currently written, and instead say that the definition, a mezzanine is, or just start off with, an intermediate level or levels between the ceiling and floor of any story, period.
Okay.
Do I need to make a motion about that?
No, we're going to, at the end, we're going to make a motion for all changes. Keegan.
Sorry to interrupt one more time, but I just have word from the moderator that Matt Paul would like to speak whenever you'd like to give him the chance.
Okay. All right. Mr. Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I heard the comments about what a floor is. I do want to point out, unfortunately, I agree with the way Keegan says he thinks it should be interpreted or would be interpreted. But we did receive a letter from the city as we were working on this issue, and it notes in that letter, this is from Mark Holland, dated January 24th. It says there is no basis. It says that the term story is not defined in the UDO, and so by the rules of interpretation in 12.1, ordinary definition should be consulted. Webster Dictionary definition of story in the context of buildings is, and it gives three examples: a space between two adjacent floor levels or between a floor and a roof. And then it just goes on to say, essentially, the space being described, which is the way we're describing it in this definition, appears to constitute a floor level, and from the exterior of the building would increase the height of the building by a measure equal to the height of the building, since it is a habitable space. So I guess my point is, and I'm just taking a quick look because I can remember this comment in the letter, that we do want to make sure we don't run afoul of just creating this circular, this intermediate level is going to be considered a story because we don't define what that is. I personally think, the finished floor to the ceiling or to the floor above is a pretty clear that intermediary level would not be a story. But, this letter, suggests that there could be some issue there. I just want to point that out.
Mm-hmm. Mr. McDowell, do you have how it's written, the changes that we've made? Do you have that?
Sorry, are you referring to the changes to the proposed text, or?
No, not just the proposed text, because I'm just trying to get a clear understanding of where we are and what we need to do to move forward.
Yeah, understood. So I think there's two questions at play. First is, of course, the definition of mezzanine, and I think what's come up in addition to that is whether or not we have a solid definition of story as well. Currently, the UDO only defines story height. Mm-hmm. And my first interpretation of that was that it, in doing so, it really kind of defines what a story is. And I think there was just some concern that we could create a circular logic in that a mezzanine space could somehow be considered a story. I think it's, again, my feeling is the way the proposal clearly states that a mezzanine is not a story under these specific circumstances unless it trips the floor area. But we're happy to explore options to make that clearer if the committee so desires. I also got a message from Mark Holland, who Mac had referenced earlier, and he's on the call. And he is able to kind of speak to the thought process with that previous interpretation, if that's something you would like to hear.
Okay. Before we get to Mr. Holland, let's hear from Commissioner O'Haver.
Yeah, the circular definition makes sense. We want to avoid that. Blaney, Commissioner Miller, I'm just curious, can we take the text that you're suggesting? If what I'm reading here on the screen, if a mezzanine is an intermediate level above the room or space in which it is located, and we added your text to that, does that not eliminate the issue of whether or not that's a finished floor? It's clearly defined as an intermediate level and not a finished floor. Would that avoid the concern of a circular definition question?
I think that'll be based on what staff, on how the staff practitioners attempt to interpret it in the future. I wouldn't think that there would be confusion, but it sounds like perhaps there has been in the past. Story is in fact defined by the building code, however, and I would, as a question for staff, if a term is not defined in the UDO, is the next step to look to the building code or to Webster's dictionary?
Keegan.
I would probably defer to Justin Rometta. He's the zoning administrator. Justin, would you be able to provide kind of answer as to the process?
Yeah, sure. So the code provides a hierarchy for when terms are ambiguous or unclear. The first thing that it points to is previous decision by courts or boards of adjustment, and previous interpretations by a zoning administrator. If those things have not been done, then the first place to look is a legal dictionary for a legal term, or an ordinary dictionary for a non-legal term.
And to be clear, I think the term story height is defined, but not story. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, that's correct currently.
Okay.
Story is defined by the building code, and I think that definition would help here. I'm going to need to step away for just a moment. I just walked over there. I'll be right back.
This is Justin Rometta again. I would say, Mr. that the other section of this ordinance clearly states that mezzanines are not stories. So I think that helps with the ambiguity there, and that as long as you meet the definition of a mezzanine, that having a finished floor or not in the mezzanine would not matter in determining whether it's a story or not.
Yeah. I'm fine at this point with leaving the word story out of the definition. This kind of different language, an intermediate level above the room or space. Above the room or space, floor and the ceiling. Okay, with that.
I just want to, staff's perspective, I'm understanding of Commissioner Miller's motion. I have it written down, and so I'm understanding if that's what you all choose to move forward with.
Does her comments have the language story in it? I can't.
It does. It states that an intermediate, it would define a mezzanine as an intermediate level or levels between the floor and ceiling of any story. And I will note, I mean, the term story, while not specifically defined, is used, of course, throughout the code. So it wouldn't be the only place that this occurred.
I got you. Okay.
And I would just reiterate Justin's point that I think the proposal is attempting to clarify, of course, that a mezzanine is not a story itself. And so I think it makes it maybe more clear than it was prior to this text change.
Commissioners, are you fine with the proposed changes per Commissioner Miller before moving on? Commissioner O'Haver.
I think if Justin is saying that a mezzanine is clearly not defined as a finished floor, I personally am okay with moving forward. I just wanted to inform you of that. I'm not sure what the other commissioners' thoughts are.
Okay, I'm seeing thumbs up from Commissioner Thomas. Commissioner Winters, I'm seeing shaking her head. Thumbs up. Mr. McDowell.
I was just going to state that if it, just for thought, if it seems that it would maybe clarify things, you could add the term finished into the proposed definition that Commissioner Miller had. Intermediate level or levels between the finished floor and ceiling of any story. That would make it even more clear. But again, up to you. It's just something came to me in this discussion.
But isn't the issue, I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm gonna get to you, Commissioner Winters. Commissioner Thomas, I saw your hand first.
Commissioner Winters can go ahead because maybe she had the same.
Okay, Commissioner Winters.
Well, my concern is that if we're talking about that seems to be like, to me, going back to the circular problem as to the definition, well, say to finished floor to ceiling as opposed to finished floor to finished floor, when we're trying to define what the mezzanine space is going from 33 to 50%, is it going to then qualify? Is that your question, Commissioner Tomasula? Your concern?
I was actually going to ask, I think Keegan to just, it broke up in my ears, so I didn't hear what he had said. The additional language, because that's kind of what I keep checking. I just want to make sure we're not going in a circle. Yeah.
Mr. Winters.
For me, I think that when we're talking about, I think the question is when we're talking about a finished floor versus that then triggers more questions. As it was finished floor to finished floor versus finished floor to ceiling, but that was the height, but it wrote it down the story height definition. So that's what I think is more so confusing, to then change the definition for the story, finished floor to ceiling versus finished floor to finished floor, which is already established in the UDO. So if we're looking to be consistent, why are we not going to be consistent with that? Or am I misunderstanding something?
Commissioner Winters, that seems to make sense to me. Again, going back to Keegan's comment of if it's clearly defined that a mezzanine is considered a finished floor, then I think that makes sense, your comment.
Mr. McDonald, saw your hand.
Nothing. More just, I guess, clarification. I think the reason that the term floor and ceiling was used is because that's what's in the building code. But I would affirm Commissioner Winters' statement that it is true that the height of any story is from finished floor to the finished floor above. And so if you want to kind of have parallel language between story height and this definition, that's of course an option. And we're happy to make that if it's more clear.
Commissioner Winters.
And I think not only with it being more clear, again, if our goal is consistency, that is that should be at the forefront as well.
Okay. So Keegan, can we add language from finished floor to finished floor at the end of that definition?
Certainly, I'm happy to incorporate that change. I can do that.
All right, thank you. Let's move on from the definition of a mezzanine to the next section. All right. Commissioners, do we have any comments for section 3.3.1 height requirements? I'm seeing Commissioner Miller.
Thank you. So I'll pull up my notes here. This is where we start to get into the language and about one mezzanine per story per building. And so I was thinking about this and trying to think about the purpose of the UDO and our zoning code versus our building code and trying to dictate design. And so obviously the UDO, as several people have pointed out, up to at least 7 stories in mixed use developments regulates building height already. So, so when I was trying to figure out, then why would we dictate further what's located inside of the building within our zoning code? In terms of the design, I looked at the purpose of the UDO, or the UDO, the initial introductory sections that says, what is the purpose of the UDO? And it says that in part, the UDO provides that the purpose of our housing code, of our zoning code, is to encourage compact development and to provide neighborhoods with a variety of housing types that serve the needs of a diverse population. And I'd say right now, as much as ever, we need to review all of our zoning code regulations when we looked at these text changes in the context of trying to identify which of those have historically led to inequitable housing that segregated and limited accessibility to disaffected groups of our community. And so in the residential context, mezzanines obviously provide the ability to make loft apartments and condos, which provide a greater use of the space from a smaller footprint. And since land is increasingly expensive in Raleigh, this would expand the availability of more affordable housing types by allowing more loft type apartments. And in addition, in the commercial context, as many people have pointed out, the city and our comprehensive plan encourages having actually greater intensity at the ground floor in mixed use centers for ground retail space in these mixed use developments. And so mezzanines also help accomplish this purpose by creating a more intense use in the first floor. So, I understand that this application in particular, this applicant was interested in thinking about a particular project that perhaps only needs one mezzanine for that project. But in my view, mezzanines, I think, should be encouraged and potentially be available to more than one level, given that in the residential and in the commercial building types, this furthers our policy goals in the comprehensive plan. And then also looking at the appropriate use of our UDO and our zoning code, that this also furthers the purpose of that. So I know we need to talk about 50% versus 33% and circle back to that in a moment, but I would be for at least where I understand that there's also the concern that we might start suddenly having unlimited height to buildings and not regulated height. And it certainly is appropriate in the building code to regulate building height. So in that case, up to 7 stories, we actually regulate height not only by stories, but in feet as well. So, I wouldn't put, as long as the building height is regulated by our UDO based on total feet, I personally would suggest that we remove any limitation on mezzanines when building height is restricted by feet. And now that we have, in those areas where building height is only restricted by stories and not regulated by feet, that in that case, perhaps we limit the number of mezzanines to 2 mezzanines in any building where building height is not regulated in feet and is only regulated in stories, so that there could be one, and you could, it's obviously in a commercial mixed use space, having one on the commercial or on the retail first floor, and then having one in the residential unit as well.
Thank you, Commissioner Miller. I have a quick question for Keegan and staff. Is there any reason as to why there is, other than height restrictions, as far as total footage, is there any reason why there's only one mezzanine permitted per building, other than height?
I think, as stated earlier, it seemed to actually be kind of less of a concern with before we eliminated the measurement in height of feet for buildings 7 stories and above, but it really had to do with potential occupancy and intensity of the building. Given that the UDO does not place limits in mixed-use districts on dwelling units per acre, there was some thought that multiple mezzanines could contribute to the overall occupancy or intensity of a building. To why this is, still in the definition with this new text change, it was really just maintaining consistency with how it exists now. There really wasn't a policy per se in there, and of course it can be changed if that's the desire of the committee.
Okay. Commissioner O'Haver.
Sorry, go ahead, Commissioner Winters. I think you had your hand up first.
Commissioner Winters, you're on mute.
No, Commissioner O'Haver, please. I saw your hand when I was raising mine, so please.
Okay. I guess I'm just still confused. You're right, Commissioner Miller. Like, it seems like this is a gray area. We're dealing with building code and building issues versus zoning code and UDO issues, and we're trying to determine height and building and merge these two together. But I guess I go back to one of my original questions. I understand the residential zonings are limited by units per acre. In these other building types, correct me if I'm wrong, Keegan, if I was a developer and I wanted to do an apartment building with all one bedroom units, and I could meet all of my zoning requirements and parking requirements and setback requirements and height requirements, is there something in the UDO? My understanding is there's not something in the UDO that would prohibit me from doing all 1-story units. Is that a correct statement?
Yes, my understanding is that is correct.
So that's where my question about density is. So if we're in a mixed-use building, or we're in an apartment building, or we're in a general building, the code is not, my understanding of the code, tell me if I'm wrong on this, the intent of the code is not to measure the number of units or the number. We don't have FARs anymore, floor to area ratios. We used to govern by that, which dealt with intensity and density. And so I guess my question is, if we're limited by height, if an applicant is meeting all of the zoning requirements prescribed in the UDO, why are we going inside the building and determining whether or not you can have only one mezzanine, only 2 mezzanines? Can they be on multiple floors or one floor? It's like, I'm confused at why we're trying to merge these two together.
Yeah, and I certainly think that's a valid question. My understanding is that the UDO really did lift a lot of the restrictions on density and or intensity in a residential context, because it does not place, as we said, that hard limit on number of dwelling units per acre. Now, that being said, when an applicant proposes rezoning on a property, there is an analysis done, and there's a way to more or less quantify the maximum number of units that you can achieve based upon all of the various constraints that you mentioned. And one of those could be the inclusion of loft spaces. And while it's unlikely that a building would contain multiple mezzanine levels, I think that's what this is really intended to address, is the marginal creation of additional bedrooms, let's say, within a residential tower, if it was to contain multiple mezzanine levels, seeing as there's no limit now in feet on the maximum height of the building. But I would think that difference is marginal. And of course, it's open to be removed from the requirements if the committee so desires.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Commissioner Thomas, I see your hand, but first, Commissioner Winters had a question. I'll get to you next. Commissioner Winters.
Going back to one of the initial statements Commissioner O'Haver made, being able to differentiate between a mezzanine and a, what was the word that you used? I can't remember. The top floor, the word eludes me. The apartment in the top floor.
Penthouse.
That's it.
Penthouse that I can't afford.
Now, see, you said that. That's what he said. The penthouse he can't afford. Okay. So my question is, going back to his original question, how then can we differentiate between a mezzanine versus the penthouse, and then juxtaposing that with the comment of affordable housing? Meaning, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Keep going. I'm sorry to cut you off. I saw Ms. McDonald.
No, I was just saying, because to me, it just doesn't seem consistent if, one, we can't tell the difference between the mezzanine that could actually be a penthouse, and then using that as a justification for it being an answer to affordable housing.
Ms. McDonald.
Thanks. I think part of the issue in differentiating the two is that the building code does not define loft, and I don't know if it defines penthouse either. A mezzanine is seen as kind of an all-encompassing definition for these types of intermediate spaces in a variety of contexts. And so that's kind of the reason for the mezzanine serving multiple contexts within the UDO as well. I think, as Commissioner Miller pointed out, a potential solution is to allow multiple mezzanines, if so desired, to provide that additional flexibility. If a developer wants to construct more commercial or retail mezzanine on the first floor and a residential type mezzanine on the top level, for instance, that's an option. But that's kind of the intention behind why this mezzanine definition is kind of an umbrella term for multiple different contexts, because that's how it operates within the building code.
Thank you, Commissioners Miller and Winters. I see your hands, but hold on one second. Commissioner Tomasula has had his hand up for a while. I want to get to him first before hearing your comments. Commissioner Tomasula.
Yeah, thank you. So I was trying to go back and just remember, like, refresh my memory as to where and how this kind of put itself into the conversation. And it was not very long ago. And I remember that a lot of it had to do with also kind of being entangled with the definition of attics and basements. And so, one, I think that this is, I just feel like that this is like making so much out of something that is already controlled by building code. It's inside the building. There's very few uses of it. They're all standard. And, I was trying to think through and messaged a few, just architect friends, and it's like, one of the simplest definitions or characters of it is that a mezzanine shares a ceiling with the space below. And it's so basic and kind of duh. And so I just, and that's defined in the building code. And I'm just trying to think, how can we simplify this? It's just, no one that I know of has taken advantage of mezzanine without classifying them as an attic or a basement. And I also tried to find if any of my friends in other cities, if mezzanines are regulated at all, and to the best of their knowledge, they aren't. So I was also just curious if there was any other precedent from any other city used, if there's any references, and I guess with that, it's just, there is square footage based off height and size of the footprint that you can occupy. And it's like, I fully respect that there are intensities that are calculated, but that is not a constraint on the entitlements for that land.
Mr. McDowell, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of dovetail off that comment from Commissioner Tomasulo. I think a part of the uniqueness of having a UDO definition is really related to the uniqueness in how our UDO measures height. I believe that in looking at some of the reports that were done during that text change to building height, there was an assessment of our code versus some comparison cities. I think we're one of the only or few jurisdictions to measure measure building height in both feet and stories. And in some ways, I think that is influencing the need maybe for a definition of mezzanine within the UDO itself, whereas other jurisdictions may simply just rely on the building code to govern it. But again, that's just providing some feedback, I think, as to maybe why we're seeing this.
Thank you for that clarification. But what about just the shared ceiling?
If the committee thinks that's more clear, of course, we're happy to have that be the definition. I think there is some utility in having some more kind of close, have it more closely parallel that of the building code. I don't know, was there an additional part to that definition, Commissioner Tomasulo, other than?
No, I just, with us going back and forth about finished floor and about intermediate and everything else, it's like, I think with any mezzanine, it is true that the ceiling is the same for both the mezzanine and the floor below. So it just seemed, to me, it made the most sense when my colleague replied with that. So, I'm not a wordsmith, so I'll leave it on the floor.
Commissioner Winters, I know you had a comment. Commissioner Winters, you're on mute.
I'm so sorry, y'all. Sorry. Just for point of clarification, because when we're talking about the shared roof, it takes me back to the picture that we were sent from Mr. Mark Paul that seems to jut out. So is that considered a shared roof, the external space?
Could you point me in the direction of that image? Was it something in the presentation, or was it something sent separately?
There's something sent separately.
Okay. I'm not sure I have that image, unfortunately.
Okay.
While Commissioner Winters looks for her comment, Commissioner Miller, I know you've been waiting as well. Do you have anything to add?
Yes, I just wanted to add my comment about trying to use this as a more affordable housing type. When we think about mezzanines and the way that they're used right now, especially if they are limited to only one story, and in the mixed use context, it's almost always that expensive penthouse apartment. And so, but obviously you can think of other loft spaces around the city that have been used to create more compact housing types, like the Pullman Station lofts on Ash Avenue that we were looking at a couple months ago. And that's more what I was thinking. If, when it's limited to one story, it actually encourages just that penthouse type of development, as opposed to providing some type of more intensive multi-story loft situation of more affordable housing units. And I'd say that this also goes back to the whole concern about we don't want mezzanines because of intensity. When it's being used on only one story or for a penthouse, that's really not increasing intensity. So, what are we really saying when we're saying we don't want mezzanines to create intensity? And that's where I'm concerned that we're specifically saying we don't want to sort of stack these type of affordable housing types on top of each other to create more of an inexpensive and affordable housing product that would be available to folks of all income levels, as opposed to the way it's written now, which is really just reserving it for penthouse apartments, essentially.
Thank you. Commissioner Winters, I see your hand again.
Okay, and then that is the reasoning in terms, so to have it sound as though it's going on various levels, doesn't that then increase the height of the building that could then have an impact on intensity, not just the amount, but also the height of the building in and of itself. Let me start there. The height of the building in and of itself, where it's not necessarily counted up to 7 feet. In terms of not 7 feet, 7 stories, that you actually start counting stories at up to 7. But if we're talking about increasing the space to 50%, add that to the various levels add that to the individual height, that does then increase the height, which then creates more intensity in terms of presence.
Mm-hmm. So I would say that, so my suggestion in terms of changing the language to address that would say only 2 mezzanines are permitted in any building where building height is not regulated in feet. So we already regulate building height in feet up to 7 stories in a mixed-use context and in several other contexts. So since the UDO already addresses building height in terms of feet, then at least in those areas, if somebody wanted to choose to have an intermediate level, a mezzanine loft that had lower ceilings to provide more compact housing and affordable housing type, that this would actually be available to them, when those buildings, as long as those buildings also, would abide by the height limitations that are measured in feet. So above 7 stories in feet, if the building height is no longer regulated by feet, it's only regulated by stories, and then I actually would not be for having additional mezzanines on multiple levels. Because then that could obviously blow up the height of the building sort of indefinitely, and create double the height, if you will. So long as there's that safeguard of regulating height in feet, that's where I would be for including mezzanines, and any number of mezzanines, so long as it matches, as long as it meets the regulated height requirement in feet.
Thank you, Commissioner Miller. I see your hand, Commissioner Winters. Do you have anything to add?
I just wanted to thank Commissioner Miller for that clarity, because what I thought I heard before the clarity of 2 mezzanines was that it could be that she was stating they could be on every floor or however many floors, which prompted my comment.
Gotcha.
So thank you for that clarity.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Haver.
Yeah, for clarity, Commissioner Miller, when you say 2 mezzanines, you mean 2 levels? Because I thought earlier we said that laterally, if there were multiple units, they could have mezzanines. But are you clarifying that whether it be the bottom floor and the top floor or any level in between, it's 2 levels when you're not measuring by feet? Is that, or are you saying just 2 mezzanines?
So I think that my suggestion is that as long as building height is regulated in feet and not in stories, that there can be any number of mezzanines on any number of the stories. So, that's obviously limited in the mixed use context to 7 feet, or to 7 stories, excuse me, that each of the 7 stories could in that context have a mezzanine. However, if it's because building height is still regulated in feet, not just in stories in that context, above 7 stories in a mixed use context, if it's not, if the building height is no longer regulated in feet, then in that case, I would propose limiting the total number of mezzanines permitted in that building to mezzanines being allowed on 2 stories, on up to 2 stories, but no more than 2 stories.
I think that I agree with Commissioner Winters. I think that limits her, safeguards against her concern, I believe.
And I feel like once we're more than 7 stories in the mixed use context, we are thinking about the more traditional retail on the bottom and a penthouse at the top. And if that's the case, then so be it. It's unlikely that there would be an affordable housing project in Raleigh that would have more than 7 stories and these types of more affordable loft apartments. But this is just trying to figure out how we deal with the fact that building height after 7 stories in a mixed use context is no longer limited in feet. So that was sort of I was trying to figure out what to do beyond that 7-story mixed use. And that was sort of
I could support that. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. I'd like to pause at this moment and see if we have any comments from the applicant, Mr. Paul, on or any other member from the public on the conversation thus far. Can we see if?
No. Oh, do you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. No, I think I'm enjoying the conversation, and no.
Good deal. Okay. Thank you. Commissioner Winters, I saw you raise your hand again.
Yeah. Okay, I need to go back to Commissioner Miller. Can you, because when you were explaining, I thought I heard you say a number of mezzanines on any given floor, which goes back to my original concern. Can you clarify that for me? I thought you said that.
Yes. So up to 7 stories, each of the 7 stories could have a mezzanine. And the reason
we're talking about multiple mezzanines. I thought you said there could be multiple mezzanines on multiple levels.
Perhaps if they wanted multiple on any single story. What I meant was, if it's a 7-story building or less, then each of the 7 stories could have a mezzanine, because of the fact that building height is still regulated in feet.
I saw Keegan, your hand first, and then I saw Mr. York second. So,
Yeah, just a clarification. The code, subject to a recent text change, TC 1319, I believe, eliminated the maximum building height in feet for districts 7 stories and above. And so for buildings within those districts, they are only measured by the number of stories. However, the maximum building height in feet was preserved for districts 5 stories and below. And I believe that's the differentiation point that Commissioner Miller is referring to, such that in those districts where maximum building height is measured still in feet, there could be an allowance for multiple mezzanines because you're still constrained, versus in those districts 7 stories and above, perhaps limiting them to a maximum number of 2 mezzanines is appropriate, such that you don't have so many mezzanines that it leads to a very tall structure in a space that might not be technically zoned or was intended to be zoned for that.
Thank you. Mr. York, did you have any questions?
Yeah, I was going to suggest, as I understand Commissioner Miller's suggested change, I wanted to read something as I've written it down to see if that captures what she's looking for. Mm-hmm. And then I'll explain why it's slightly different than what the wording she suggested. Mezzanines are permitted only on 2 stories of a building 7 stories or higher. Otherwise, mezzanines are permitted on any story of a building. Now it's worded slightly different from saying where height is regulated by story and not feet. And the only reason why I say that, there are some conditional use zoning districts as well as planned development districts and so forth, where 200 plus feet building heights were put in place. And so those very tall buildings, which you're trying to limit to 2 mezzanine levels or 2 stories of mezzanines, would be exempt from that cap, if that makes sense. Because in the old code, it wasn't necessarily stories and feet, it was feet. We measured height by feet, so there's a lot of zoning districts, older zoning districts, with conditions that measure height by feet only. And so, and for the very tall height limits, you would be exempting stories or buildings taller than 7 stories. And I don't know that that's your intent. So this is a section that if we were to change how height is measured for 5 stories and below, you may want to consider changing. But as the code currently reads, 7 stories and higher have no corresponding foot height limit. And so if we limited it to 7 stories or higher, we wouldn't have the problem that old zoning conditions or planned development districts might create. So my question is 2 parts. Does that make sense? And 2, did what I read reflect your intended change?
Yes, that makes sense. I think that's great. The only thing I might change is in the second sentence, as opposed to referring to the number of mezzanines, leading with the number of stories, which may have a mezzanine, as opposed to the number of mezzanines, which may be allowed in the building. Does that make sense? So mezzanines are permitted on only 2 stories, or if a building has 7 stories or more, then mezzanines are only permitted on 2 stories of that building. Otherwise, there is no limit on the number of stories which may have a mezzanine or something like that.
I just want to make sure our notes were corresponding with your intent.
Okay. So what we're proposing, I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson.
I think that this supports that, but just a visual also that came to mind was like Union Station. I believe Union Station has 2 mezzanines and is under. So that's just an example of visuals for people who might be trying to see what that might look like, and I think we all think totally okay use of a 1-story tall 1-story building. Technically.
Do we have any other comments?
Matt, can you repeat that? Raleigh Union Station has what mezzanines on 1 story?
I looked at a friend also brought up Union Station, and I looked at the tax records, and it's actually the building's a 1-story building, but it has 2 mezzanines.
Commissioner Winters.
Under Commissioner Miller's recommendation, that would be okay. Is that not correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha.
Just saying that, like something like that, as the text change is written now, Union Station wouldn't even be allowed. So just for kind of context.
Gotcha. So we're okay with the first 2 sentences of this proposed text change, but the last 2 sentences I'm hearing that we want to change per Commissioner Miller and Mr. York's comments based on the 7-story limit. Is that what I'm hearing?
I could support that.
Okay. Commissioner Winters, did you have anything else to add? I can't. You're on mute.
I'm trying. People, work with me. I'm still processing it. So I know we have to move on possibly, but I'm still processing this. So just.
Gotcha. Before we move on, does anybody have a record of the proposed last 2 sentences of this so we can move forward with it? Ms. Commissioner Miller or Mr. York, do you have as it would read before moving forward? And striking these last 2 sentences and adding the comments and the additions that we just made. I'm sorry, Keegan, do you have anything?
I was just going to add that I think the last sentence, I would recommend considering retaining that because it makes it clear that you can have additional spaces, subject to the inclusions that Mr. Miller recommended. It makes it clear that someone who wants to have, let's say you're in a district 7 stories and above, and you have 2 mezzanine spaces that are permitted and don't count as a story. You could even have a 3rd one. It just would count as a story, and that makes it clear that that's allowable. Does that make sense? That's why we included that sentence to begin.
Noted. So I misspoke. I meant striking the second to the last sentence.
Yes. Yeah. I just wanted to make sure that was clear from our perspective.
Okay. Commissioner Miller, I saw your hand.
Yes, and I just typed out the draft too, so they don't have to type it and send it to Mr. York and Mr. McDonald.
Mm-hmm.
my proposal is to change it to, if a building has 7 stories or more, mezzanines are only permitted on 2 stories of that building. If a building has 6 stories or fewer, there is no limit on the number of stories in that building which may have a mezzanine.
Mr. York, do you have any comments or suggestions to that sentence that Commissioner Miller read off?
No, it sounds fine, but when she mentioned 6, it raised a concern with what I had drafted, because 6 does not have a corresponding foot height. So what we would want to say is buildings 6 stories or higher rather than 7.
Gotcha. I agreed.
Okay. Mr. McDonald, I saw your hand.
Yes, I was just going to kind of reiterate that same point, that the zoning districts move from 5 to 7. And thus, if you're zone 7, that's the only way to get 6 stories. And in that instance, yeah, you would be limited to whatever number you settle upon. I just wanted to make sure that was clear.
Okay, so what I'm hearing on section 3.3.1, we're going to keep the first 2 sentences as proposed. We're going to replace the 3rd sentence with Commissioner Miller's comments and Mr. York's amendments to her comments, and then we're going to keep the 4th and final sentence the same. Is that what I'm hearing? Thank you. Okay, Keegan, I saw your hand again.
Just so I'm clear, would the text read for things zoned for 7 stories and above? I think, or that are 6 stories and above. I think it would maybe make it clear for those zones 7 stories and above, because then they can kind of read all the requirements based off that height limitation, if that makes sense.
Mr. York, your comments to that?
I'm trying to understand Keegan's comment.
It's just mainly for consistency, because the only way a 6-story building is to be zoned for 7, but everyone understands what their height allowances are based upon that zoning designation at the end of their the zoning acronym. So you're zoned for 7 stories, and thus with that 7 stories, you're permitted 2 mezzanines, and that you could be up to, but you could choose only to have 6 stories. It's just kind of a point of clarity, but just to create consistency with how the designations are made within the code.
I'd say one thought experiment: if the building was zoned for 7 stories or above, but in fact was only being built to have 5 stories or fewer, then they would, in that context, that 5-story or fewer building would be limited to 2 mezzanines. And I think that's
Yeah, and that may not be. At one other, you could say, you could include a measurement in feet, if that's something that you'd want to do, for buildings taller than, and then you could put the taller than the maximum height in feet of the 5-story district. That would make it more clear, for instance. Just an idea.
Well, my understanding is new buildings coming in cannot be built 6 stories or higher unless they're zoned 7 or higher. And so, I agree that if you have a mixed-use district with a 12-story building height limit or a 7-story building height limit, and you choose to go lower for one reason or another, you lose that capability, and you have to actually file for rezoning to take advantage of what other 4 or 5-story buildings could do. And so I don't know whether we want to word it such that it forces a downzoning in height just to accomplish something. If our concern is the height of the building, then and if you want to say buildings taller than 5 stories have this capability. if you want to tie it to a zoning district, then I would suggest saying buildings taller than 5 stories have the 2 floors on which they could have mezzanines, and then all others could have mezzanines on any level.
Great, so I have the new languages. If it is taller than 5 stories, mezzanines are permitted on only 2 stories of that building. If a building has 5 stories or fewer, there is no limit on the number of stories in that building which may have a mezzanine.
Okay. How do we all feel about that? Commissioner Haber, are you good with that?
Yes, I heard that. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. All right, we'll move forward with those proposed changes.
Yes, I guess one question, Commissioner Mann, is, and sorry I had to step away for just a half a second, but I know Commissioner Winters was saying she was still wrapping her head around it, so I just wanted to touch base with her and make sure that she's good with that, because I don't know that I heard her say that, so I just wanted to make sure.
Yes, sir. Commissioner Winters, are you fine with the proposed changes?
Yes. We're talking about, if we're talking about the height, specifying height restrictions, as you said, up to, was it 5 feet or 6 feet for clarification?
5 stories.
5 stories, I'm sorry. I keep saying feet, stories. Okay. I think I'm okay with that.
Okay, okay. Keegan, let's move on to the next slide, please.
So I believe actually that concludes the 2 portions of the text change.
Oh, okay. Oh.
The other slides were just alternatives, but I think that this was the last piece to be discussed. And it sounds like a resolution was arrived at for the language.
Okay, thank you. At this time, do we have any more comments from the applicant or from the public before we move forward with a motion and a vote?
Just want to thank you for the thorough look. We appreciate it today.
Yes, sir, you're welcome. Okay, do we have a motion? Do we have a motion for the 2 proposed changes that we made to the definition language and the section 3.3.1 of height restrictions for residents? Commissioner Miller.
I move to recommend the Planning Commission to amend and approve the text change as amended, to amend the text change as discussed with respect to the definition of mezzanine and the number of mezzanines allowed in or the number of stories in a building that are allowed to have mezzanines. And I make a motion, so I make a motion to amend the text change and a recommendation that the full Planning Commission accept these amendments. This text change and its amendments are consistent with the comprehensive plan and reasonable and in the public interest because they, hold this up, encourage compact development and provide neighborhoods with a variety of housing types to serve the needs of a diverse population.
Do we have a second to that motion?
I'll second.
Commissioner Haber, second. Okay, Shanitha, Ms. Eason, do you, it's time to go forward with the vote, I believe. Can you provide us with the roll call for the vote?
Yes,
Thank you,
sir.
ma'am.
All righty. Chair Mann, how do you vote?
Aye.
Ms. Miller,
Aye.
Mr. O'Haver,
Aye.
or Tomasulo,
Aye.
and Ms. Winters.
Aye.
Okay, so it looks like we've got a unanimous vote to move these recommendations forward to the full Planning Commission. Keegan, remind me, will these recommendations be heard at our next full PC meeting?
I believe given the timeline, this is a later committee meeting. I'll have to verify, but I think it would probably likely be reported out at the meeting following next meeting. Yeah.
All right, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Do we have any more comments, questions from the commission regarding today's meeting? And any other comments from the public at this time? I'm seeing none. So at this point, we will adjourn our 18th of June meeting of the Text Change Committee. I appreciate everyone's time. It's been 2 hours. I appreciate everyone's time and diligent working on this issue. So thank you, everybody, and we will see you at the next Text Change Committee. Thank you.